Hello, hello. Welcome to today's session of Selling the Couch. I hope you're doing well, having an incredible day. So it is so freaking hard to pick gear as a podcaster, both when you're starting out as well as just various points during the journey. And this trying to figure out and pick this gear gets more complicated depending on a couple of different factors. Whether you are doing the podcast solo, whether you have a co-host, whether the guests that you are going to be interviewing on your podcast are coming in live, or are you doing it over the internet? It just adds such a different layer of complication. And today one of the most common questions that I get when it comes to podcasting is like, Mel, what is a good setup for me? And today I just wanted to walk you through the 4 most common scenarios when it comes to podcasting gear setups, and based on the 4 most common scenarios. We actually have a buying guide that is part of our Healthcasters course that we give to all of our colleagues. So it paints these scenarios and then paints every other possible scenario, includes all the gear recommendations. All they have to do is literally click on it. And today I actually wanted to share just most of that guide with you, just because I feel like sometimes it's just good to be helpful, and I've learned a ton when it comes to podcasting. Now having done this since 2015, so the thing I really wanted to start out with is I worried so much about gear when I first started the STC podcast. I had in my mind that I needed this pro level setup. I needed sound blankets and $1,000 plus mics and all of that kind of stuff. And if you're watching this on YouTube, beautiful imagery like this and high quality DSLRs and all of that stuff. But when STC first started, I had a teeny tiny budget, and literally I used a $60 mic and a super cranky mic holder, and all of these things. It costs right around $110, and that's honestly what I used for the first 5 years of the STC podcast. And I kept worrying about whether people would notice, whether I would get emails being like, Mel, you really need to upgrade your sound, blah, 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 right? All of these fears and narratives that I had in my mind. And can I just be honest with you, 99.8% of listeners didn't seem to notice, and they didn't seem to really care. In fact, I used that same setup for 4+ years as the STC podcast hit 1 million total downloads. And so before we even jump into gear recommendations, I think this was one of the struggles that I had in creating this episode. I didn't want you to hear it as, now go and purchase all of this gear. It's more like, hey, it's what you should actually be optimizing for at the beginning parts of your podcasting journey. And I consider first 2 years beginning parts is getting to become a better storyteller, getting to become a better interviewer. And if you're doing video, like I am, just getting to be more comfortable in front of the camera, because doing this video thing does not come at all natural to me. And it's been quite a journey. So let's jump in. The first scenario, and this is really the most common scenario that most of you that are listening, that are thinking about launching a podcast, are going to run into, which is you are a single host for your podcast. So you host your podcast, you do solo episodes, you record those, and then you will interview guests over the internet. This is honestly what I have done since 2015. I have not had a co-host on the STC podcast thus far. I have not done live interviews, meaning where the person comes. Well, I've done one, but the vast majority of them have been over the internet. And so the starter setup that I would recommend is, first of all, the mic that I would look at is the Samson Q2U, SAMSON Q2U. I actually used the Audio-Technica ATR 2100, but they upgraded that mic and they increased the price of it. And the reviews on it are kind of a little bit mixed. So that's why I don't recommend that one anymore. And it's hard to find the previous version of it. But if you look at the Samsung Q2U, it's around $60 on Amazon. It's what's called a dynamic mic. And so a dynamic mic, without getting too technical into it, you really want to try to go with the dynamic mic, especially if you are recording in a room that's not like sound treated. So which is the vast majority of us, right? So you don't have like insulation and all of this kind of stuff. And so that's like that's what I would recommend. Now, these mics need to be held up onto a shock mount. And the main reason why you want a shock mount is, and you'll kind of even notice this if you're watching this on YouTube, sometimes when I talk, there's times where the mic, where my mouth hits the mic. And a shock mount basically allows you to absorb some of that sound so that it doesn't get picked up in the actual recording. There's a bunch of them on Amazon. I just did a quick glance. The one that I saw that had a lot of reviews was this brand called Coolertron microphone shock mount. So it's KOOLERTRON microphone shock mount. But basically do a search of like microphone shock mount and then you should be able to come across this. The next kind of thing that you need is you need an onstage what's called a windscreen. And so there's a bunch of these companies that make this. This is also known as a clown nose when it comes to podcast recording. So this right here, if you're looking at my mic right here, this is my Shure SM7B. Do not get this mic right when you're starting out because there's just a lot more gear and technical stuff that you have to navigate. It's not worth it, even though it's a great mic and it sounds great. But this mic actually has this pop filter, and that's basically this foam material right here. And so the main purpose of this foam filter is a couple of things. So one is generally when we talk, we spit, so any saliva and stuff doesn't get into the actual microphone and mess up the electronic stuff in there. That's one of the main reasons. The second reason is, at least in English, when we say words that start with a P or a B, like generally we tend to make these pop, 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 right? Like that noise, that popping noise. And for someone that's often listening on, for example, most people are listening to podcasts while on a commute, or they might be hiking and have AirPods or something plugged in. Those P noises are really can be really distracting and can be loud and you don't want to like annoy your podcast listener, right? So basically, this windscreen helps to buffer against some of that sound that's coming in. The next thing that I would recommend, especially if you're starting at this setup, is what's called a pop filter. The one that I use is, you can do a quick search for the windscreens. Those, there's a one from Onstage. It's called the Onstage foam windscreen. That one is like $4 or something. So and it's rated really well. Onstage is also like a common brand when it comes to music kind of stuff. So it's a reputable brand. The next thing is the pop filter, and you don't technically need a pop filter because the windscreen acts kind of as a pop filter as well. But I like to have a second pop filter, especially when I was doing the episodes, because I just felt like it added a different layer of filtering, and it really like limited those plosives and just made the sound just a lot better. And the trade-off with putting this pop filter is it looks basically like a big circle and it goes like right in front of it, and it looks a little clunky. So especially if you're doing video, it can show up kind of weird and hide some of your face. So that's the only thing just to think about. So if you are doing video, I would recommend just leaving the pop filter off, just so that you get a better visual experience. If you're doing video, for example, like you're taking your podcast and you're planning on having the audio, but also putting the video component of it on YouTube as well. The next thing that we love to do or I would recommend is you having some sort of a microphone stand, right? So you've got your microphone. There's really two options here. There is the option of a stand, which is basically you put your microphone on, twist it on, and you've got a nice stand. The one that I recommend is by this company called Gator Frameworks, and it's called the short-weighted bass microphone stand. And the benefit of this one is it's weighted on the bottom so that it won't easily tip over whenever you have it on your desk. And like at a practical level, let's say you're recording or you're talking to a guest and you're writing something down and it hits your hand, the microphone then won't tip over, and now you've got a big clanking noise that comes on the actual recording. Now, the other option that you can think about is what's called a mic arm. Now, this gets the weighted microphone stand. I think it's around like $25-ish. The other option is what is called a mic arm, and that's what I am using for the STC podcast. The benefit is because I basically want to walk into my home office, plug in 3 things, and be good to go. And with this stand, again, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see this. Like, it's very easy to move, and I can just move it into the screen, out of the screen, and when I put it away, it's just kind of tucked in on the corner, and everything is ready to go. Whereas with the weighted stand, you got to likely plug the mic in, all of that kind of stuff. I wanted it very easy to set up kind of thing. And so, but I know that many of us may be recording podcast episodes, for example, from Office or something like that. So a stand may make more sense than, having like a proper arm that's there. The one that I use is by a company called Rode. It's the Rode PSA-1. It's around $100 on Amazon, which is why it's a little bit more expensive. And now if you look on Amazon, you will see a bunch of $20-ish mic arms. But if you look very closely at them, what you'll see is a lot of them have springs on them. And I tried a spring one and it was fine for a little bit. But if there's one thing you're taking away, try not to buy a spring mic arm, because what ended up happening for mine was over time, it would start sagging. And then the other more annoying thing was the springs would start creaking over time. So then I would get these little noises, or I would have to be super gentle, and I'd be constantly worried about whether the sound of the spring was getting picked up. So that's the starter set, and that can range anywhere from about $100 to $225. The big driver, of course, is whether you go with that Rode PSA mic arm. There's also a couple of higher end companies, I think Blue is making one that has a mic arm as well. That one looks visually again, this is such a small thing. This Rode PSA mic arm is fantastic. It's super stable. I've literally had this for 4 years, no issues with it. In fact, I have a second one that I use for my, when I'm just doing videos without the podcast mic. I have a second mic and I use that one as well. And it's no issues with it. But visually, again, if you look on YouTube, you can see visually it's not the best looking, and the Blue one is kind of cool because it's one solid arm, and it just looks, and it's a matte black, so it looks pretty sweet as well. But again, it's a minor thing. From a quality perspective, this has been great, and I haven't had any issues with it. Now, the second scenario is I am the host of my podcast, and I'm going to interview guests in person. This format is becoming really popular with video YouTubers. So think like Joe Rogan, think like Ali Abdaal, think about anyone that is basically bringing guests in, and they've got a whole live setup here. Now, the benefit of this setup is you're seeing another person in person. It's like when you do in-person therapy versus telehealth. Telehealth gets you 80% of there with the experience and all of that. But there's something really powerful about when our clients are actually in the same room as us. We can pick up nonverbals. We can just pick up subtleties that, we may just miss on video. Visually, also, it looks great if you are planning on putting that content on YouTube. That's highly what I would recommend, because honestly, if you're also going to taking the time to do a live thing, you might as well repurpose the content strategically. But again, that gets expensive. Will probably be another episode at some point. Let me know if you would like an episode like this, but on video setups. I don't want to get too much into that because that can get, there's just a lot of more technical stuff. And I feel like this one's already technical enough. Now, the negative part of being live with somebody and you having this proper studio setup is you'll have to set up your home office or like a co-working space, or if you have own a building, you may have to have a dedicated studio space, something like that, where it's just practically a lot better to have a setup there and then literally for you and the guest to be able to walk in and just record the episode versus having to construct something, deconstruct it, and then construct it back up. It just becomes more logistically a little bit more of a nightmare. The other issue with it is, it's already hard sometimes just to coordinate times for podcast guests. What we do for anyone that comes on the STC podcast is I use Calendly. So I will just send a link and they pick between a couple of slots that are available and they just have to show up online. So think about that. Plus they got to, drive to you or meet up at a location. It just adds more complications. And then I just wanted to highlight and double tap this thing. I'm not going to get too much into this, but you'll need likely a multi-camera setup. If you are having a single host with a single guest, you'll likely need almost a 3-camera setup. So one for you, where the camera's looking at you, one, the camera's looking at the guest, and then one where it's both of you together, right? Translation, this can get really expensive and technologically complicated very fast. So, which is why, honestly, I haven't gone down that route of setups, because I've seen some of these behind the scenes pictures of these live podcasting studios and they look fantastic. And I'm sure they're getting their ROI, most of these folks. But it's also man, I just don't have the budget for it. And then 2, it just seems like there's just more things to coordinate and figure out. Now, that being said, eventually I would like to do a multi-camera setup here for STC. So we've got a single camera setup right now, but I would love where it's possibly an angle that's coming from one side and then possibly an overhead shot. So that people, if I'm writing something or drawing something, there's an overhead shot that I can show stuff on. Now, with this setup, it's basically the same setup, but it's going to cost around $700 to $1,000 now. So let's just say starter setup, Samsung QTU. You'll need 2 of those. You need 2 mic holders. You need 2 windscreens. Pop filters, you technically need 2 of those, but you can leave those out because I think visually it looks a little bit better. And then you need 2 tabletop stands and 2 mic arms. Now, here's where I think it gets a little bit more complicated, because you'll need to figure out a way to record the conversation, because it's not directly through a computer, for example. So the thing that I would recommend is using what's called the Focusrite Scarlett 2i2. And what you can do is plug in your podcasting mics into there and then plug that into a computer and then capture the recording that way. I think that's probably the cheapest route to go. Now, once you start rolling that Focusrite in, you're going to need a different cable than that comes with the Samsung QTU. Well, it comes... I believe the Samsung QTU comes with 2 types of cables. So one is, it's what's known as an XLR USB mic. So you can plug it either into the USB slot on your computer or the XLR slot on your XLR slot. So XLR slot is this thing right here. Again, if you're looking on YouTube, you'll see it. It's basically a higher quality sound, but it's a different type of cable. I'm pretty sure the Samsung QTU comes with it as well. But as soon as you have that Focusrite in, you're going to need XLR cables because it doesn't support you plugging in multiple USB cables, as far as I know. So you'll need 2 XLR cables, plug that into the back of the Samsung QTU, plug that into the Focusrite 2i2, do that for each of your mics, and then plug the Focusrite back into your computer, and then you can be sure you'll be able to hear. So, all right. And then the last 2 scenarios, the first is I have a co-host for my podcast, my co-host and I connect over the internet, and we will interview guests over the internet. So basically, this would be like the most common scenario would be, an example of somebody doing this would be Therapy Reimagined, right? With Katie and Kurt, and they do this as far as, when I just recently had an opportunity to do that. So Kurt logged in from his house, Katie logged in from her house, I logged in from my house, and then we recorded everything over the internet. But Kurt and Katie co-host the podcast. So the benefit of this setup is you are with it's just from a logistical planning perspective, like coordinating 3 schedules, I think it's just so much easier. You literally just have to log in, and it's great, right? Now, the negative of this setup is I feel like, the other benefit again of a co-hosted setup is, if you get sick or something like that, it's just, you've got a co-host there that can take over. And also the other side of this is I think there's something really nice when you connect with somebody and you co-host a podcast. It's fun to do a project together. Now, the negative parts of this are, as with most things, I feel like when you're starting a podcast with a co-host, you have to, there's a relationship and a connection that's being formed with the person. And so, it requires nurturing and all of those kind of things. So, in this sort of scenario, right, where I would do is I'm going to almost talk about it like a setup for each host, right? This will cost basically between 100 and 225. So you need basically the Samsung QTU, the mic holder, the windscreen, the tabletop stand, or the mic arm. And each of those mics are plugged into the computer, and you are basically recording. Now, there's a bunch of different ways that you can record this. I still use Zoom to record a lot of the STC conversations. I am playing around with a couple of different ones. Ecamm Live is one that I'm playing around with as well, because I use it for like live streams as well. There are a couple of different other companies that are allow you to do like remote recording as well. So, but I would say like for that setup, like if you have a co-host, this is probably kind of the best sort of scenario setup. Now, the final scenario is I have a co-host for my podcast. We get together in person to record, and we will interview our guests in person, right? So it's basically going to be like 3 people minimum in sort of a live scenario. This is honestly a dream setup because everyone is in person. The connection, the opportunity to network before and after the interview. This setup can, side note on this, you can often do a setup or version of this like at industry conferences. For example, you have a booth or you interview people in your hotel room or a space in between, like some sort of a third space that's connected to the hotel between sessions. I haven't done this, frankly, because the logistics of it stress me out. But I think it's a cool scenario, right? Because you can especially start to think about like if you have a co-host for your podcast, and even if you're doing a solo one, even doing it on the road, I think it's a pretty cool pretty cool scenario there. Now I'll come back to this, but the negatives of this setup are there's a lot of logistics. You'll have to have some sort of, again, a setup like this in a co-working space or a home office. That's the ideal scenario. So you're not like building and breaking down again. The one thing I've learned with the STC podcast is I used to do a lot of like building putting the gear, like I'd have a completely clear desk. And then when it was like podcasting day, I would plug everything back in, and inevitably like something wouldn't work. And I'm like, what in the world? So I would like spend all this time, one, setting it up, and then the other scenario, like trying to figure out what is happening here. And what I realized is just way better to just keep it all plugged in and just plug in as minimal as you needed. Now, again, with this sort of like 3-person live, you need, again, lots of multi-camera setups and all of that kind of stuff. Now, here's the setup that I would recommend. Now, this, you will notice the cost like significantly bumps up. So just a general rule that I have found is the more people that you have on your podcast, whether it's a co-host or a scenario where you're doing it live, the costs will generally like exponentially go up. So even like in this scenario where where you've got co-hosts, where you're recording in person, where you've got guests, and even up to 4 guests, this scenario can run upwards of $1,900. So you've got a Samsung Q2U, which is like 3 or more of those. You've got a mic holder, 3 or more of those. You've got a foam windscreen. You've got a tabletop stand or a mic arm. What I would recommend in this scenario is the Rodecaster Pro or Rodecaster Pro 2. There's also a new one that just came out. I think it's called the Rodecaster Pro Mini. I have the original Rodecaster Pro. And again, like a little tip, I'm sure I haven't done too much experimenting or like research on the Rodecaster 2 and the Rodecaster Mini, but I'm sure they're like fantastic devices. But also look at the original Rodecaster Pro because it's still a really great machine, and I've used it for 4+ years now, and like I haven't run into a scenario where I have thought like, oh, I wish I had a Rodecaster 2. And at a practical level, you can often get it much cheaper because it is like an older model. So once you have that Rodecaster Pro, the cool thing of the Rodecaster Pro is you don't need a separate computer. So it actually has a mini SD card that you can actually put in the back of the Rodecaster Pro. So I would recommend like a 32 gigabyte one. And once you put that in, you can actually record everything directly into the Rodecaster Pro. Now in this scenario, again, because of all these mics, you'll need an XLR cables. And so just account for buying as many XLR cables as you need, as many as you have. Now that's sort of the scenario that I would recommend. Again, in this setup, anytime you introduce any of these new tools like a Rodecaster Pro, there's just more stuff to learn. Again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it when you're first starting out because it's just, for me, looking back, one of the best decisions, and again, this was practical because I just didn't have the funds, but one of the best decisions that we made for STC in the first 3 to 4 years was keeping it really lean and not building out this current setup. This current setup that I've had for about 3 years, it's cost around $5,000, and I built it up over time. It's a very nice setup, but I knew I was going to be doing YouTube videos. I knew I was going to be doing talks, teaching masterminds and all of that stuff. So it made perfect sense for me, but it would not have made sense for me in the year 1 and 2 when I was still figuring out like what the heck I was doing with STC and all of those scenarios. If you happen to be watching again this on YouTube, I will link to a video of what my setup actually looks like if you are curious about it. So I hope this is all incredibly helpful, and I know this was a lot of like technical conversation, but I think the main kind of takeaways from this is really think about what setup that you want. My recommendation is, especially in the early days of your podcast, try to do the interviews. If you're going to do interviews or if you have a co-host, try to just do it all over the internet because it just, it makes things a lot less complicated and you don't have to account for a whole bunch of different kind of scenarios. And it just becomes a lot more frustrating. So, and then the other thing is, again, you don't need an expensive setup to run a successful podcast. I think that's something that I had ideas about. And even the thought of like, I had this weird thought of like, I need an expensive setup. How am I going to afford this expensive setup? And then, oh my gosh, having an expensive setup is way too overwhelming. And so I would say you don't need any of it. And you can just be really thoughtful about and keep it lean, especially in the first days. And here's kind of the side benefit that I mentioned earlier that I wanted to come back to, which is there's something really powerful and humanizing when you do a very basic setup and people see your journey versus like when you start at a pro level setup, people are like, oh, it's like you're less relatable to them. And it's even something, to be completely honest, I struggle with currently with STC because I've invested a lot of money into this setup, but it looks great and visually and all of that. But then I'm like, man, like there's a part of me, I kind of miss the old days where it was like a webcam and a $60 mic. So maybe I'll go back to that one off for some of these episodes. But just wanted to at least highlight that as well. Now, if you are a therapist that's listening and you've been sitting with a podcast idea for a long time, we also have this free workshop that you can check out over at sellingthecouch.com/podcasting workshop. It's called Using Podcasting to Grow Your Business, and it has a ton of tips and strategies that I've learned here over the past 9+ years as STC has continued to grow. We just passed 1.8 million downloads, so we're getting close to the 2 million download mark, hopefully here pretty soon. Have a great rest of your day, and appreciate you for tuning in. Bye.